So today's guest on the Hoffman Reed Lessons in Leadership podcast is Julie Stothard, Chief Executive of BESTrustees. Julie, great to have you here today.
Afternoon, Paul. Great to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So Julie, I think what would be really good as a starting point is if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your career and how you got to where you are today for those people who are thinking they'd quite like to be in the chief executive hot seat themselves at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'd be very pleased to, Paul. So my background is that by profession, I'm an actuary. So I've been working predominantly in pensions areas of actuarial work. Started out in an insurance company background and then moved into consultancy. So I worked with some very large and very interesting pension schemes, but purely in an advisory capacity. Then I moved to another firm where I took on more of a leadership role, but again within the actuarial business, so running the actuarial and consulting practice, then broadening out into investment as well. And then over time, I stopped becoming a consultant myself, just simply because there wasn't enough time to do the leadership of the business and to work with clients and give each of them the time and attention that they needed. Then more recently, I've moved into a different field, which is to become the chief executive of the trustee business. So we're a firm that provides professional trustees to work with pension schemes, so acting on their trustee boards. So for me, it's been a brilliant opportunity to take what I've learned and what I've really enjoyed about the leadership side of a pensions business into a slightly different aspect of that.
Okay, which opens up the question instantly. What have been the sort of key leadership lessons you've learned and enjoyed?
Well, I think first of all, what I'd say is I've actually been surprised that I enjoyed leadership. So, much earlier in my career, I really enjoyed the technical side. And, when I was progressing through my career, I said I didn't want to do the leadership and the management. And I guess I kind of fell into it a little bit in one of my roles where there was a gap, and I sort of fell into it and moved into it. I think that what I have learned is that leadership is very different to management. I've been very fortunate to work with some brilliant people on my leadership team, and I think that's made it so much more enjoyable. One of the key things I say is that I don't know there's such a thing as a great leader, because I think it's all very much about the different roles and being able to adapt to that role at the right time. And somebody would be great in one leadership role and it probably just wouldn't work for them in something else that's a little bit different field or in a different stage of the business. I think it's important to remember as a leader that you still do have a team and shouldn't be thinking that it's all about you, because it isn't. It's really important to listen to the people around you, but also be prepared to take the difficult decisions when they need to be taken and to stand by them and effectively own them and take accountability. I think it's also important to be visible to the business and to be approachable, so people can see you as being part of this, and to want to work with you. But I think it very much depends on the role, whether you're looking at taking the business to its next stage or sort of consolidating on what's been done before. Different nature of the business and different type of work that's been undertaken requires a different skill set, and you've got to be prepared and able to adapt to the situation around you.
And I guess we're all experiencing probably the biggest disruptive event any of us have ever experienced in a business capacity in COVID. How have you kind of adapted to that, and how have you adapted the business and the business practice, and what have been some of the challenges along the way?
Yeah, so it was interesting for me because I'd only joined the business a few months before. So I effectively spent the first few months in the role really understanding about business and looking at the internal aspects, and have been very much focused on being more outward facing at the beginning of last year, and that quickly changed. I am by nature a bit of a cautious person at times, so I think it goes a little bit with the actuarial field, and looking to manage the risk. So I'd had an inkling that things were going to go into some form of lockdown before they did, and I've been reading enough on people doing sort of trial runs that that's what we did. So we were able to switch over from the systems quite effectively. As a business, I was in a much better position than many people, because most of the people that work within the business are used to working remotely if they're not working with clients. But I did have a head office team that had always worked in one location. And it takes a little bit of getting used to working remotely. One of the things that we did do across the business was set up regular briefing sessions. So we haven't really done that before. So I've actually had a lot more time with the people in the business than I would have done if we were working physically in our head office in London location. There are some challenges. I think particularly being able to sort of pick up on nuances is a bit more tricky. The virtual meetings are an absolute godsend. If we'd been trying to do this 5 years or so ago, we would have been in a much more difficult position. So being able to see people and talk to them, not just through a conference call, so much easier. But it is quite tricky to do that with a large room and actually be able to read the room. So I certainly think that when we're able to, there is definitely a place for face-to-face meetings. But perhaps not as frequently as we would have done them before. I think people have found that for a quick one-to-one catch-up, it works very well virtually.
I think a number of the guests we've had on this show over the last couple of weeks have pretty much said the same thing. We had Phil Jones, the chief executive of Brother, Martin Keeliger, the chief executive of Walford Cunningham Hayes, and Stephen Rowe, the chief executive of Vision Super in Australia, and they were saying the same thing. They say you can tell what's happening via video, but you can't pick up on those nuances, and you can't react to those nuances because you can't see them, and therefore you've got to be a little bit more mindful and have those one-to-one conversations with people as well, and just say, how are you doing, and not expect a blanket response of, yeah, I'm okay, because actually it's very easy to hide behind that on camera when you're not there in person.
Yeah, and if you were in the office and you wander past and you perhaps see somebody who maybe looks like they're perhaps struggling with something, or maybe they're doing something quite interesting that you'd like to learn a bit more about. So you have to be more mindful of how you can still continue to do that remotely, and it requires a bit more effort and a bit more thought. And to remember, even when you're very busy, to set aside some time to do that.
So obviously the trading environment's been difficult and tough on everybody in the last 8-9 months now, as we're in lockdown 3 here in the UK. What's kept you going through these sort of tough periods, and how have you managed to balance that, managed to find that work-life balance?
Yeah, I mean, it has been tough. I suppose for me, because I was going through a period of change anyway, settling into a new job, I've just had to change my sort of focus and direction a little bit. I think I'll put it down to my sort of Yorkshire roots. I think I'm quite a tough cookie at times when I need to be. So digging a little bit deeper into reserves to be able to do that's been important. I think absolutely remembering the human side of things and thinking about other people and how they might be coping has been really important. And being sort of realistic about what you can achieve in this time, because my focus has moved away from some of the things I expected to be able to do, and just to accept that and know that I'll come back to those when in a few months' time, hopefully, when things start to change in the environment a bit. But so not to be sort of too harsh on yourself and not doing the things that you set out to do.
Okay. And I think you made a really interesting point there about it's not just how you're coping, it's about how others are coping as well. Yeah. How have you gone about maintaining compassionate leadership and helping your team grow during these sort of challenging times?
Yeah, so we're having sort of, as I said before, regular meetings, which gives people a chance to talk about what they are working on, see if anybody can help them with things, any where they might need some support, or perhaps somebody has experience that they don't themselves have, and they could share. I think perhaps one of the more recent challenges has been that we've had a few people join the business for the first time during lockdown. And for our people that are working with clients, that's been a challenge for them, because they would normally be looking to be doing quite a lot of networking over this period, which is a lot harder to do. So I've been trying to make the effort to spend time with those and look at how we, can help them to settle within the business and this new field that they're working in. More recent challenge has been bringing somebody into head office and trying to think about how we would go about that. So we're quite a small team, and we've had to approach it in a more methodical way than we perhaps would have done, but that's not been a bad thing. So, thought about what an induction program would look like, the things we'd like them, to work on to begin with, who they need to get to know with the business, and facilitate that. So it's been more thinking up front rather than doing it. Perhaps we would have done it a bit more on a sort of week by week basis in the past. And there's been remembering to, because they're not there and I can't just see how are they settling in, is there anything I can help with, to remember to make the calls and put time in the diary to catch up.
I think that sounds like a wonderful induction period, and far better than mine when I started my career 20 years ago. I remember coming in on my first day, and the partner who'd hired me had left, and so I had a new partner that I was reporting into, and he really didn't know what to do with me. So he gave me a copy of what was the matrix directory of all the IFAs in the country. And said, these are the top 100, ring them all and see who needs our services and wants to speak to me. And that was my induction.
Yeah, you've been given something to do that keeps you out of their hair.
Yeah, definitely. Who would you say you admire most as a leader, Julie, and why?
Yeah, to be honest, I've been, when I was thinking about today, you sort of start to reflect on a few things, and I've been given that quite a bit of thought. And I'd say my answer sort of goes back to something I said earlier, that I think that people can be great leaders in the right place at the right time. So I think the skill sets need to just be appropriate for that particular role. So I wouldn't like to call out one person, but I've been very fortunate to work with some great people in the business, and some people I particularly respect, being either great and charismatic and good fun to be with, and I've really appreciated that. People who've helped me to develop my career, and I think that's something that comes a little bit as you go further in your career. I would say I take a huge amount of pleasure now at seeing people that I've worked with developing, and sometimes going on to things in other firms. When you see their careers progressing, and that's something that I find particularly rewarding. And then people outside the business world that there's some people who've done some pretty horrible things in the past, but are actually being very good leaders in doing that. Or you look at some of the sports people, some of the managers of some of the teams. I think there's a lot of things that you can learn from looking at leaders outside your own field. And the beauty is we get to work with lots of different people and can see things that think, well, I really like the way they do that, and equally I'm not so sure I would do it that way.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's part of the philosophy of this podcast and video series, is really to look at leadership in those ways and share best practice. And it's interesting there, you mentioned sports people and people outside of the business world and the leadership they show. That is something we're looking to introduce to the series later on, and we've got a couple of people lined up that we're trying to do sort some times out with, who will come on and we'll speak about different aspects, especially from say the sporting world, or maybe even the academic world.
Oh, that sounds excellent. I should be looking out for those.
One of the things you mentioned there is clearly leadership's about the right leader in the right place at the right time as well. It's not just about them as an individual. But how do you go about evaluating yourself as an individual, and how do you know if your leadership is becoming less effective?
Yeah, I think I'm quite a big one for reflecting on things. So I will think afterwards, perhaps if there's been a meeting or some presentation I've given, I do think afterwards about how it went and how it might have gone better. as I mentioned earlier, I do think it's important for leaders to have a good team around them and to work with that team. I've been very fortunate with people that I've worked with, and so I'd like to think about the different ways that I work with people. So just to give an example, in previous role I had a couple of people on my leadership team, one of whom we thought in a very similar way to myself. So if there was something I wanted to get done quite quickly that I thought was quite straightforward and not contentious, and so I would work with them because I knew that we were on the same wavelength and we'd get it implemented quite quickly. There was another person who thought really quite differently to me. So if there was something I thought was contentious or I wasn't sure about what I was doing and really wanted to be challenged, then I would work with them because I know that they didn't see things in the same way as I did, and be prepared to accept you haven't got it right. I was a call I was going to make on something a few years ago, and a couple of my team members told me I was wrong in a nice way. And I changed what I was going to do, and they were absolutely right. It would have been completely the wrong thing to do. So I think just don't think you know all the answers. Do listen to other people. I've got different experiences and different perspectives, and sometimes they're a little bit closer to the other people in the business as well, to see the wider perspective.
And how do you take that on board and take it on board in a way which actually enhances the solution you were looking to put in place?
So, I mean, sometimes it can be, like saying, changing how you were going to do things. If you think you've got it wrong, say so. So, I will hold my hands up and say I've got things wrong, and I will apologise to people if I think that perhaps I haven't called something properly. But also, don't be too hard on yourself. When just because you're the leader doesn't mean to say you have all the answers and are going to get it right all the time. The important thing is to listen to what other people are saying, make the decisions. And sometimes you just got to stick with it, even if people don't agree. If you think you're absolutely confident it's the right thing to do, then you have to have the courage of your convictions, but think very carefully about how you would implement it, so to minimise any sort of fallout later on. I mean, at the end of the day, leaders are trying to do the right things for the business. It's not always going to be what everybody wants in the business, but if it's for the right thing in the longer term for the success of the business, sometimes you just have to make some tricky decisions and see them through.
Yeah, I really relate to that. I mean, one of my previous roles, I had a leadership team, and there were 4 of us on the leadership team, and 3 of the leadership team had a very clear vision of what needed to be done to solve a problem. And I really didn't agree with them. And I actually spent half a day doing a workshop with them, asking them really quite pointed questions around why their thinking was in that way, and how that helped us achieve the outcomes we were looking to achieve. And in the end, they all ended up agreeing with me that actually we probably needed to take a different tack to where they were going. But it was a very difficult situation to be in, given I was probably the more junior member of the team, but actually I had to ultimately make the decision as to where we were going. And I knew in my heart of hearts that they were wrong, but I didn't want to come out and say, you're wrong.
Yeah.
So I had to work with them to try and get to the solution. We ultimately went with, which proved to be very successful. But it's not always easy to take people with you when you don't necessarily agree with what they're saying.
No, it's not. And I absolutely agree. Try your very best to get people on the same page, because you really want any decisions like that to be backed by the whole leadership team, because they will get questioned about it later on. You need everybody to be able to support it, even if it's not necessarily what they would have chosen to do. They need to at least understand why that's the decision that's been made, and be able to support it in a business context.
What's been the biggest sort of leadership crisis you've had to face, and what did you learn from going through it?
Yeah, so I know I keep talking about teams, so you probably won't be surprised when I mention something to do with that. So I lost in a very short space of time 2 key leaders of my leadership team, 2 key members of my leadership team, and that did sort of throw me, because I think it's really important to have a good, strong team around you, and it's really important for the business to see that as well. I'd say what I learned, I wouldn't do anything differently, because I understood why they were moving on, and they got other opportunities that were more suitable for them at that stage in their career, and that should be what you want for your people that you work with, and it is what I wanted for them. So I still believe that was the right thing, but perhaps not to get sort of too freaked by it at the time it happens, because there are always other people in the business that can and are willing and want and able to step into the brink, as it were, because if you've got a good business and good people in the business, there are other people who are knocking on the door for those opportunities. So I think probably to perhaps be a little bit more aware of who else might be out there, and to get them a bit more involved before it gets to that stage, so to spread some of the opportunities around a little bit more, so you get a chance to see who else would be good to work with going forward.
Now, we live in a little bit of a world often which is dominated by certain leadership characteristics, which we see a lot, and sometimes they're for the good, and sometimes they're not so good. What leadership qualities would you say you think are overrated, and why would you say that?
Okay, so again, I think it very much comes down to the role that's been asked of somebody to do. So I think that there are certain things people would think of being key leadership traits, but are not necessary in every role. And I pick sort of 3 out here. So one would be charisma, second would be creativity, and the third would be being an expert. So in some roles, that would be absolutely essential to be able to cover all of those off, but in many it isn't. People will think it is. So some of the most successful leaders have not been the most charismatic people. I've come across people in business who I know have done a great job for their business and was really looking forward to meeting. They've been quite surprised. They're sort of a bit shy and a little bit sort of less forthcoming. So it wasn't what I had in my mind of what they would be like, knowing what I knew about them before meeting them. Creativity, you need to, if it's a job that requires that, many do in leadership, you need to be able to recognise that and have people around who can help with that. But you don't need to necessarily be creative as a chief executive yourself. And the same with being an expert. I mean, sometimes being the expert can be a hindrance, because you can get a little bit too involved in the detail of what's going on. You need to be able to pick up sufficient detail quickly, assimilate that, and be able to make the decisions, but you don't need to know the nitty-gritty of everything. And I think that's quite often been mistakes in business, that people who've been an expert at doing something have been promoted through the ranks, and they're not necessarily being good at being a leader. They were excellent at the technical role, but not necessarily at leading a technical business, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's the 3 really interesting points that you raised there. I mean, charisma, we always say charisma is probably the one which is so difficult to define, because you can see somebody who's very charismatic, but actually that can be a really, really good trait, but it can be a really quite disastrous trait as well, as we only have to look to our cousins across the pond for in that regard. But equally, the technical piece is often important. Being an expert is often important, but equally, it's also it cannot be important. I think it's really difficult when you start to look at the combination of those 3 things. And creativity, it's a role of any chief executive, isn't it, to understand where their strengths lie, and then bring people in around them who compensate where they're not that strong.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think being self-aware is so important, and not to feel that in any way it's something that's lacking about you, not to be able to cover everything, because nobody can.
No, absolutely. I think self-awareness is one of those key factors that we always look for when assessing senior level individuals. Julie, I've just got one final question today, and that's really, is there anything you would like to add to the interview that we've perhaps not covered that you think is quite an important leadership lesson?
I think probably just to reiterate some of the points I'd already made, which is to, make sure you work effectively with your team, a strong team with complementary skills. Don't be afraid to bring people onto your team that you know will challenge you, because actually that's a really good thing. Having a team that's too comfortable to work with is not a good thing as for a leader. To be, as you just mentioned, self-aware, and not to be too critical when you don't set, perhaps achieve as quickly as you would have liked to the things you've set out to do, and be prepared to adapt as you go along, not be too rigid in following a route that you'd originally set, because sometimes things just do need to change, and that's actually the right thing to do. And enjoy it.
Absolutely. Enjoyment. Julie, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, Paul. Thank you.